The title of my talk is called Unraveling Psychosis. It's a double entendre about how psychosis gets unraveled, but also how we as those who work with psychosis try to unravel it. And I want to begin with a brief vignette, okay? The charcoal drawing of the whitened face of the great French mime, Marcel Marceau. I don't know how many of you know Marcel Marceau, but I had this charcoal drawing of Marcel Marceau at the entrance of my office. And my patient, who I'll call Amy, was very fond of Marceau, and she would walk into my office every day and nod to the drawing. And she never said hello to me, but she would say hello to the drawing and then come in and sit down. And in that drawing, it was all black. It was charcoal, black, but you would see his whitened face, the mime's whitened face, and his white hand, gloved hand, putting his hand up like this in supplication, and a very expressive face. So they were two of a kind, she told me once. They understood each other implicitly. And following the exchange with Marcel Marceau in the drawing, she would sit down and begin to speak. Before leaving each session, she would bid him goodbye, and that was kind of a ritual that I allowed. Now, one day, she was in analysis with me 5 days a week. One day, several years into the treatment, suddenly she appeared very troubled and paused before the drawing, turned to me and said, "Marcel Marceau is dead." I thought, and I felt sad, because I knew Marcel Marceau was old, but I hadn't read the paper that day. I didn't know of his demise. And then in the middle of the session, I noticed something unusual taking place. Suddenly, Amy was looking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, as if she were watching a tennis match. And I let it happen for a little while. And then at some point, I stopped her and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Well, don't you see him?" And I said, "No." And she was pretty incredulous. And I said, "Tell me what you see." And so she said, "Well, there's a homeless man in your office." And she was shocked that I couldn't see him. And she added, "He's mute." Now, I noted to myself the connection between her hallucination and the silent art of the supposedly deceased mime. "He's ragged, thin, hungry," she added. I asked her why she had been moving her head back and forth. And she said, "Well, the mute was scurrying back and forth from a corner, hiding in a corner of my office, and then he'd come very, very close to me, almost touching my knee like this." So here she was making the same gesture that Marcel Marceau in the drawing was making. And she demonstrated with her hand. I, of course, noted this similarity. Later that evening, I looked in the papers. Did Marcel Marceau die? And it turned out he was alive and well. So Amy had killed off Marcel Marceau and created a mute homeless man to take his place. For the next 3 months, Amy and I shared our sessions with the mute. I could not see the homeless man and therefore relied on her to be my eyes. Each of us needed the other to dance the dance of therapy. She rendered him visible to me, and I, through my understanding of his function, converted his muteness into words. "He sounds lonely," I said. "He seeks solace." I was blind, she was mute. She allowed me to see what she saw, and I allowed her to symbolize and represent. We both engaged with her hallucination, albeit with me as a co-participant. Thank you for showing yourselves. Amy, a middle-aged woman, lived alone. Her sessions with me comprised one of the only human interactions in her day. She had difficulty knowing her emotions and telling me what she felt. Her creation of the homeless mute served multiple functions. He helped us both understand her loneliness and her fear. He expressed her hunger for human contact and nourishment better than her words ever could. The mute assured her of company. It stood in for the mute unconscious, and it was a hallucinated figure of an other. It was the ghost of Marcel Marceau, something dead in her, yet whose spirit might be brought back to life. Finally, the mute tested my capacity to care for her and keep alive a desperate, neglected, and emotionally famished human being. Amy's loneliness and the psychotic symptoms it engendered is not rare. Loneliness in psychosis refers to the isolation in chaos and the hungering for reality, being isolated from others as a result, the natural loneliness when carried before what would be called the break, what Winnicott would call environmental deficiency, the loneliness of feeling exiled from one's better, stronger, saner, more whole self. All four causes of loneliness can be understood by the fact that humans need others to anchor themselves in reality, a human social cultural reality, which then anchors them in the physical reality. That psychosis results in further loneliness should be patently obvious. Persons who are diagnosed with psychosis are hospitalized and medicated. They're placed in seclusion rooms, separated from their loved ones and families. The condition isolates them. The institution isolates them. And often the medication puts them in further exile from themselves. Also, the stigma of psychosis and hospitalization gets internalized, and the patient feels shame and further withdraws. So though the hospital may be needed for someone who suffers acute psychosis, it also tends to erode one's individuality, robbing autonomy, and because patients are frequently treated like children, it encourages regression. As they become part of the so-called system, chronic patients often develop additional symptoms to allay their loneliness. Research has shown that the more one undergoes inpatient hospitalizations, the more loneliness one suffers. On the other hand, some patients stop taking their medication or find another reason to be re-hospitalized because the hospital is the only place where they find people who talk to them and take an interest in them. I recently was in Israel and I was asked to do a case conference on an inpatient locked ward. And I spoke with a man who had had 28 hospitalizations. And I asked him what he thought his main problem was, and he said loneliness. And I said, well, what's your life like when you're not here? And he said, it's terrible. I have nothing. I have no wife. I have no family. I have no profession. I have no home. And then I noted, because I was observing before the case conference, that he was very friendly with the people there. They knew him. He had been hospitalized 28 times. They respected him. He was a very intellectual and spiritual man who people listened to there. So I told him, I said, you get a lot of attention here. Maybe you feel more at home here. And he said, yes. And so I said, well, there's a dilemma here, right? On the one hand, you want to be independent and grow. And on the other hand, the hospital is the one place that gives you this attention and nurturance and recognition. So we have to be aware of that. Psychotic symptoms both express self-world exile and attempt to cope with it. Bereft of social relationships, one can be maddened by loneliness. Psychotic symptoms are a way of coping with the agony of loneliness. Amy created a mute homeless man to convey her sense of loneliness to me and also to provide herself with some companionship. Harold Searles described a woman who hallucinated bugs and turned them into people in order to have some company. In a paper I wrote with Mike Selzer, we describe a woman who hallucinated 17 children as a desperate tactic to care for her abandoned child self while providing herself with a family. It's often said that individuals labeled psychotic are alone because they retreat from reality and live in their inner world. Their need for others is reduced because their inner world is what counts. Freud advised against working analytically with psychosis because he believed their retreat from the external world, including relationships, precluded their ability to form a transference. That so many individuals with psychosis complain about feeling lonely and create symptoms to deal with their loneliness disputes this argument. That is why I say that the therapist will find that the healing core of the encounter with psychosis lies in the relationship itself. In most cases, one or more relationships have played a central role in the onset of psychosis, which is frequently undergirded by trauma. And in such cases, it is the therapeutic relationship that potentially provides the best medicine. But what is the nature of this therapeutic relationship, and what aspects of it are central to recovery from psychosis? For the rest of this paper, I'm going to try to take this question as my chief concern. I'm going to discuss my own psychoanalytic approach to meeting the challenges of working with psychosis or with people experiencing extreme states. And this approach focuses primarily on providing safety, forging a working alliance by meeting the patient where they are, and allotting them maximum personal agency, understanding their symptoms as attempts at adaptation and restoration of the self, not a disease, and coping with loneliness, and working with the transference and countertransference. I focus on strengths as well as weaknesses. I view the patient as a whole person rather than a collection of symptoms. I prioritize subjective experience and affect. And I focus on the patient as a true collaborator in their own treatment. So those are all the elements that I feel are very important to treatment. The treatment calls for the unique appreciation of each person. We are all vulnerable by ourselves, and we are vulnerable to one another. Working with psychosis brings us in touch with human susceptibility, which involves an awareness of our own radical solitude, danger, helplessness, and mortality. Most of us defend against this awareness, which may explain why many avoid working with psychosis, but it can also explain the rush to medicate those who show psychotic symptoms to move them and us away from these realities. Now, there are a few, like Freud actually, and Bion, and Eigen, and myself, who claim that everyone has psychotic and non-psychotic parts to their personality. It's just a difference in degree. When patients present to us, often using primary process and projective identification as their major source of communication, our task is to gradually and gently introduce them to a split in their ego, that split being the psychotic part and the non-psychotic part. When a patient develops an observing ego, or already has one, and is able to acknowledge the limits of what they find credible. So, for example, some patients will say, I know this sounds crazy, but, and then they go on. But the fact that they introduce, I know this sounds crazy, means that there's an observing ego, aware that there are two ways of seeing what I'm about to tell you, right? That's a good sign. You work with that. Until that happens, though, I find it's very important not to enforce a dominant reality beneath which the patient's view of the world is erased or disregarded. The therapist who can find the non-psychotic parts of the person and align with them in earliest sessions has found a partner who recognizes that exploration can lead to liberation. Non-psychotic parts of the person are revealed in the patient's ability to, like I said, have an observing ego, test reality, differentiate between self and other, inside and outside, enter into a relationship. Even if that relationship has delusional qualities, it doesn't matter. Just the ability to enter, to connect, and enter into a relationship, I find is very, very positive. Edward Podval, who was a Buddhist psychoanalyst, named 5 indications of non-psychosis, what he called islands of clarity or marks of sanity, that one should look for. In other words, don't just look for symptoms, a list of symptoms, and say, okay, this is what's psychotic about this person, and then you ignore the rest, everything else about the person. So he had these 5 islands of clarity. One was if a person is repulsed by their symptoms. Another is if the person showed some desire to go beyond the self. Another was an urge for discipline. We underestimate, and there's very little literature on how important discipline is, the fact that people can adhere to discipline in any way, writing, gardening, cooking, anything, attending sessions regularly, compassion for other humans or even for animals, right? For any sentient beings. And finally, courage. Courage points to the ability to face difficult emotions and experiences that are necessary for recovery. Amy, the patient I just told you about with Marcel, she told me after a while that I was seeing her that on her way to my office, she saw hundreds of rats. And she had to wait until there was a little path that she could really run through and then come to my office to see me. So, you know, the medical model person would say, oh, hallucinations like that, give her medicine. I saw this as an example of her courage, that she was coming, you know, against some resistance in coming to therapy with me, but she took that challenge upon herself until, you know, the rats parted like the Red Sea in the Bible for Moses. And she was never late, which was very interesting. A patient I'll call David came to me in an acute psychotic state, believing he had special powers and perhaps was a prophet. To cope with the loss of his sense of reality, he was in the process of creating a narrative that would match his symptoms. Along with his delusions of grandeur, David complained of high anxiety, intense confusion, and a devastating feeling of failure. Despite the fact that he was in the throes of a psychotic episode, I noted that he had the discipline to search for a therapist online who specializes in psychosis. Me. The courage to ask for help and to expose his vulnerabilities, the ability to continue his college classes and maintain many of his friendships, and the willingness to drive 1 hour each way for his therapy sessions. Finally, these are the islands of sanity and clarity that show a very positive prognosis. But finally, he said, perhaps he was a prophet, leaving room for the possibility that he might be wrong. These were significant islands of clarity. So, safety. Several variables tend to make, safety is very important when you're working with anybody, but in particular, I think, with psychosis, because most people agree that fear is a constant, is Bertram Karen said, there's one thing you know for sure when you're working with psychosis, and that is that people are terrified. So if people are terrified, you have to think about how to make them safe in the treatment. And think about what makes people feel unsafe. Unpredictability, unfamiliarity, intensity, impingement, silence, and speed if you rush too much. Space can also make people feel unsafe. I had a patient who was rather regressed, and one day he was feeling closer to me. So one day he asked if he could sit closer to me, and I said, sure. So he moved his chair next to me, not next to me, but closer. As soon as he did this, he started associating to cannibalism. And I could tell that he was getting very frightened. So I quickly stepped in and said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you that you can also move your chair back," which he did instantly with enormous relief. And I tell this example to illustrate how danger is often accompanied by the inability to perceive alternatives. I presented my patient with an appreciation that the situation was not fixed and that alternatives existed to decrease the threat. The first step for the therapist is to understand what signifies danger to their patient. It's not always simple or straightforward, because reading that riddle can be quite complicated and it can shift rapidly. At one moment, a patient may signal their wish to be left alone, and in the next, they might demand that the therapist rescue them. Needing to be seen can be rapidly replaced by wishing to remain invisible. So to make matters worse, especially at the beginning, the patient is more likely to communicate through actions rather than words. Putting their fears and wishes into words would require the patient to have self-awareness and want to share that information with the therapist, which could be a dubious proposition. Even if one assumes that the patient wishes to know themselves, it's doubtful that they believe the therapist will understand them in a way they insist on being understood. They might declare, "If I say I am Jesus Christ, it's because it's true." Okay. In this case, the desire for interpretation and understanding has to take a back seat to protection and providing safety. That's much more important at that point. I conducted a treatment with someone I'll call Matt, who felt that he was being terrorized by demons, so much so that he refused to come to my office, and because he was afraid that he would bring the demons with him and that they would contaminate my patients, who he saw as weak people. Right. So I agreed. I said, it's okay. I meet the person where they are. And so if that was too scary, I empathized with his predicament, and we conducted the treatment on the phone for quite a while. And at one point, he also told me that he was afraid that these demons would contaminate his family if they are real. So again, the "if they are real" indicates the possibility that he himself might doubt his perceptions. So you look for those little clues. It doesn't mean you pounce on them. Ha ha ha. So you don't believe them. No, you don't do that. But you note that. And maybe later you might find a time and place to recognize and discuss how convinced or what the doubts might be. This brings me to the work with symptoms. Like all symptoms, psychotic symptoms are a way in rather than a way out. I believe that you have to take symptoms very seriously, and that by doing so, it facilitates a rapport with the patient, because you're inviting the patient to be a credible informant of their own condition and partner and a collaborator in their own treatment. If one eschews symptoms, the only clue that the patient is really giving us about what ails them, then we're left with an unequal relationship in which the therapist has no choice but to play doctor, defining what is wrong with the patient, taking full responsibility for the way in which to fix what is wrong. And also, by artificially eliminating symptoms, as we do with medication, one takes the risk of sealing over the problem rather than integrating them into a healthier manner. So a patient I'll call Carol became enamored with her boss. And when she confessed her love to him, he did not reciprocate, and even told her he was involved with someone else. Carol developed a psychotic erotomania and toward this boss, and a delusional system to deny the obvious. She wrote him letters, love letters, And she believed he was sending her signs of his love in a number of indirect ways. They had to be indirect because they weren't, that wasn't what he felt. Every period, and she started paying attention to periods and commas and punctuation in his emails, in everybody else's emails. Somehow it was conveying to her that he indeed loved her. She wrote daily love letters to him, which I took from her, and I told her I would say for her, because I knew she'd get fired if she sent them to him. So I had this stack by the end of this episode that she had. She was unable to sleep, and she was agitated and hypervigilant. And so I did have her medicated, but just enough to allow her to calm down and sleep in order to engage in the necessary reflective work of treatment. Sometimes a little bit of anti-anxiety can do the trick. You don't have to bring out the big guns and the antipsychotics just to take that edge off so you can do the work that is necessary. Little by little, Carol replaced her claim that my mind broke with another, my heart was broken. Because there she was getting closer to the truth. Her delusional system was understood as her manner of adapting to reality. Her boss, in fact, did not love her. That was too painful to bear. And then the therapeutic work centered on mourning a love that never was. When patients present with bizarre psychotic symptoms, it's easy to wipe them out with meds. Yet this establishes the patient's mistrust in the entire system and a lost opportunity to collaborate in the meaning-making enterprise that psychodynamic treatment can be when it is at its best. We all have the goal of helping patients expand their understanding of reality, to tolerate and regulate their emotions, and return to a life with better coping mechanisms. We try to convey to patients that they have it within themselves to understand and change themselves. So along with Michael, we've established a few guidelines regarding how to work with psychotic symptoms. And the first is you have to realize that you take what you get. This is what the patient is giving you. You take it, and that's what you work on with them. The fact that you respect and are paying attention to their symptoms rather than trying to get rid of them comes as a surprise to them. So sometimes that in itself will enable the therapeutic alliance. Rather than treat symptoms as a sign of a disease, it's helpful instead to regard them as efforts, however flawed, at adaptation and caretaking. And so you have to ask yourself, together with the patient, what are they adapting to? Many people think that there's a person hidden underneath the psychotic symptoms that needs to come out. It can be more helpful, we believe, to view the person as revealed in their symptoms. The symptoms are a window to the person. They can be a way of attenuating affect. They have heuristic value. They're meaning-making attempts. And also, people always talk about psychotic breaks, that there was a before and an after. But instead, we view the symptom as a bridge between what was before and what is after, right? So I think it's much more helpful to think of the symptom as a bridge between these two states rather than as a break. And that continuity, helping a patient build a continuous narrative, is actually helpful to people. It establishes their authority, and it gives us a clue to their major issues. My patient, Matt, who was ridden with demons, right away, you have a clue that he's dealing with fear and he's dealing with aggression, right? That he was afraid to come to my office because he was afraid he would contaminate others with these demons. So right away, you have something to work with if you tune into the symptoms and what their function is. Also symptoms have intelligence, they have logic. They're not just emotions gone berserk. So one patient claimed that he was dead, right? talking dead, but dead. And what I learned about the patient's life is that his life was one of constant physical abuse, which had driven him to a path of immunity. Being dead offered that protection. So an empathic response could be, instead of saying, oh, you're not dead, look, you're breathing, you're talking. No, you have to meet them where they are. Oh, I see now. No one can hurt you because you're dead, right? That's an empathic. It's meeting the person where they are. Later in treatment, you can ask the person whether there are any disadvantages to being dead. And of course, finally, symptoms communicate. No matter how tentative, confused, or smokescreened they are an effort to reveal something. For the first 6 months of treatment, back to Amy, one day after 6 months that I have been treating her, suddenly she said to me, where's that Japanese screen that used to be here? And I said, which Japanese? What, you don't? She said, there was a screen here between the two of us. I said, describe it to me. And she described this beautiful screen with flowers, but it was transparent. I wanted that screen. but I realized that it took her 6 months to feel safe enough with me to not have a barrier between us. And so she no longer needed to hallucinate that screen, which made her feel safer with me. So what I'm emphasizing here is that psychotic symptoms tell a story, they communicate, and they possess object-seeking functions, in particular in their attempt to balance the conflict between their object needs and their safety. Now, I just want to say some words about countertransference. Christopher Bolas wrote that working with psychosis can be distressing, not only due to the psychosis, but because of how the patients deconstruct the defenses crucial to our peace of mind. He believes that to be normal means to deny certain realities, causing us to live with illusions. I mentioned this earlier. Psychosis breaks down these illusions and forces us to do so as well. And many therapists who've chosen this line of work state that patients who experience psychosis see through their defenses, challenging them, the therapist, to confront themselves. Perhaps this is what Harold Searles meant when he wrote that we learn the most about ourselves when we work with psychosis. This is to say that one cannot escape the self when working with psychosis. It is both a boon and a bane. Bion described the ideal listening attitude as one devoid of memory or desire. In preparation for their first encounter, therapists are likely to anticipate their meetings, not what Bion said. Anticipation contains a protective fill-in-the-blanks before we meet component. It's a way that we try to protect ourselves from surprises, right? Reflecting on certain questions prior to the first meeting, though, can put a limit to the therapist's unrealistic expectations of themselves or their patients. Examples include, what do I expect from my patient? What if they don't provide it? What do I require to freely roam inside my own head? It is instructive to periodically review one's questions, and should one's answers change, ask oneself what might be responsible for the shift. A therapist working with psychosis should be mindful that a shared reality may not exist or may only appear later in the therapy. There may not be an agreement about who the patient is, who the therapist is, let alone the role that each is to play in the other's life. One needs to be patient and become comfortable with ambiguity and enigma. Knowing how the patients experience themselves facilitates the therapist's ability to make contact with them. The therapist working for the first time with a patient undergoing psychosis may be surprised at how quickly the patient wishes to declare who they are. Christ, a dead man, the target of unbelievable envy, omniscient. The rapidity with which some patients introduce themselves to their therapist may be to test the therapist's willingness to accept them as they are. Whatever the reason, patients are providing the therapist with a way to see the world through their eyes. The therapist can then use this information to shape their interventions. But unlike these patients who immediately tell you who they are, there are those who feel too threatened by being known. And in both instances, the therapist's aims remain the same, seeking a better understanding of the patient's sense of themselves in the world. But here, the therapist's initial focus is different. With the patient for whom concealment is paramount, the first order is to understand the patient's wish not to be known. So you suspend some of the questions you might ask, like, can you tell me about yourself? If you see that that's going to be too threatening, in favor of respecting the patient's need for hiding. Accepting someone as they present themselves favors what they are hiding from rather than who is behind the mask. Treatment begins with the therapist communicating an appreciation that the patient is hiding to feel safe. In this case, I indicate that the more I understand the danger confronting my patient, the more effective I can be in helping them create safety. By accepting that the lens through which the patient sees the world is one of danger from which their only protection is camouflage, I see them as they see themselves. However, there is one caveat. I believe that the patient's wish to reveal themselves will ultimately emerge. Hans Lowald wrote that the patient identifies not only with whom the therapist sees them to be, but also whom the therapist sees themselves as capable of becoming. So my final words, I want to circle back to the beginning of my paper when I talked about loneliness, but this time in the therapist. Working with patients who exhibit psychosis can induce loneliness in the therapist. Therapists, especially beginning therapists, often feel frightened or lost when working with psychosis. They don't understand the patient's communication. They feel unable to reach the patient in order to establish a therapeutic alliance. They may identify with the patient's helplessness and despair, or feel hopeless with regard to being able to help them. They may feel an absence of empathy for the patient's condition, or the patient might be angry over the therapist's aloofness. Collaboration may be lacking. All of these experiences can result in the therapist feeling disoriented, alone, unsure of their professional effectiveness, and worse, unsure of their personal identity. Searles wrote that the schizophrenic patient, he used the word schizophrenic, I try to avoid it, drives us mad the way they were once driven mad. We're often made to feel the utter loneliness and alienation that our patients who experience psychosis feel. Perhaps most importantly, the person diagnosed as psychotic reminds us what our sanity costs us in terms of lies and denials. They remind us that our character development does not simply accommodate the vector of our constitution and personal history. It defends against the nature of reality itself, the utter indifference of nature, the immensity of the cosmos and our smallness within it, the fact that our existence is an accident and yet matters so much to us, the heartbreaking fragility of all whom we love or hope to love, the impossibility of having with others what we dream about, and the finality and annihilation of death. That's how I see life. They said Freud had a dark view. Patients with psychosis in treatment, I can't read my own writing. A patient with psychosis in treatment stands with the therapist on the borderland between a humanly ordered world and the chaos from which humans draw order. The therapist must accompany the patient into that terrifying territory, one of which the vast majority of sane people, quote sane, mightily repress and avoid. One is reminded of madness. One is reminded that one can go mad. And one is reminded that one's sanity itself is also a kind of madness. If reality is too threatening to bear, then psychosis can be understood as a process by which the imagination runs rampant, overpowering reason and the repression necessary for its proper functioning, creating delusions and hallucinations that mirror the tragedy of being human, while creating a world that idiosyncratically expresses that tragedy while attempting to preserve life. Each of us, psychotic, non-psychotic, must do something when the gap between our social reality and our desire for company and reality becomes too wide, lest it turn into a devouring abyss. What we do to fill that gap can be many things, right? It can be a new friend or a love or a life project or religious or spiritual engagement. It can be an addiction. It can be sex. It can be madness itself in the form of hallucinations and delusions or extreme seclusion. As therapists, we work with the last two components, hoping to provide a therapeutic relationship that encourages the patient to realize life and form self-enhancing relationships. I'm going to close with a little passage from a patient who I treated who was going through a very extreme state. And I encouraged him, he was a writer, so I encouraged him to write about his experiences. And this is a little passage from what he wrote. When the burden of your existence has so little left to contain it, your very reality as a person is being destroyed. Without the rigor of an identity and the social scenes in which it is defined and belongs, you spill into a shapeless, slick mess, like an oil spill, or jump from surface to surface like a fire out of control. You become a terrified animal who knows too much but not enough. Exiled from the homeland of your very self, no place inside or outside is safe, and there is nothing in you to separate the two. Everything is gone except a throbbing mass of sentience invaded by a strange and ugly world. Yet, there still beats within you, the tiniest of all hearts, a pulsing fist raging with white heat. Inside that clenched fist is a black piece of paper holding a request written in blood in a language bubbling up between the living and the dead. This is an ancient and universal language made up of the sounds of the night, of terrible loneliness, of mortal conflict, and of death cries, the lingua franca of original desperation. Translated, that request says, I am here. Please see me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Perfect. We have 15 minutes for questions or comments.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's just really so much in there, so much research packed in there too of what I found too in the research that just very true.
Who's speaking? If you can introduce
sorry,
yourself.
I'm Pat Turner. I'm a PhD student studying psychosis, attachment, and psychodynamic approaches to strengthening attachment security. So a lot of what you said resonated with me. I wanted to ask you, because it sounds like you've done a lot of time reading through the literature on this. When I looked at the relationship between living alone and self-perception of mental health recovery for people who have been through psychosis, it actually showed that people who live alone see themselves as recovering more over a year than people who don't live alone. And that surprised me because I was expecting, because like you, I was expecting to see like when you live with other humans, that should be grounding, right? And like orienting, but it was the opposite. and social satisfaction was related significantly to perceived mental health improvement. So I was wondering, like, how would you, so I was kind of like floundering interpreting the results.
Well, I would need to know more about that study and who, how many people are in that study and whether there was a control group. I would want to know more because I'm not aware of that study at all. The only hypothesis I can throw out might be that sometimes, family members can be quite derogatory towards people who are experiencing psychosis, and there's all kinds of family enmeshment that can keep, many times people get better and then they go back to their families and they regress again. So it's not in vogue to talk like that because we're not supposed to blame families, but sometimes loved ones do not know how to interact with their children or spouses, and that can create certain tension. We feel alone and lonely, not just when we're living alone. We can feel much more lonely when we're around people who don't see us, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like when you were talking, that like the quality of the relationship actually matters in addressing loneliness, not just a human body, but like
absolutely
that felt safety in the relationship. Thank
you. Sure.
Right. There's a question. Is there a reference list for these readings, or maybe you want to mention your book that's coming out?
Yeah. So I've read almost everything written about psychosis. And there will be, an introductory chapter that reviews all of the psychoanalytic literature, not on the treatment approaches of psychosis. So my book is going to be coming out next year, and it will include, if you have a particular question about anything I said, you can write to me and I'll give you the reference for that. Okay.
Hi there. I wanted to first thank you so much for talking about the psychodynamic aspects of working with altered experiences. I think so often the psychodynamic gets pushed aside.
Yes. Who am I speaking to?
Oh, sorry. My name is Chelsea. I'm a therapist here in Sacramento.
Okay.
I work psychodynamically only with individuals with altered states. And I think it's so important that people get to hear what you're describing. So first of all, I really want to thank you so much for that. Also, I really wanted to point out, I loved how you described the process of inviting someone to maybe look at a potential alternative, or, quote unquote, a potential, not interpretation, but I think it's so important for people to kind of hear these other pieces or potential meanings. And I think a lot of places will say, allow the person to come to that on their own. But I know if I'm struggling, I'd like someone to maybe toss out a potential. And even if I disagree with it at the time, over time, if there's something to that, I would rather have heard it earlier. So I think it was really lovely how you helped, or you described helping someone, maybe see that there may be something else to it, even if they're not taking that right away. I think it's respectful to the client to let them understand, hey, maybe there's something to this. And if so, I want to hear their opinion on it. And
timing is very important for this.
Right.
You have to feel that the person is open to hearing. And I think before you can do that, you have to really listen to what they're saying. What is their narrative? Where, how do they understand things? But you look for those openings when they have doubts, when they show other sides, because most people don't just show one thing, no matter how convinced they are that they're Jesus or that they're Moses. There are going to be these other little statements that say, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that.
And our own willingness to say, I'm not wedded to this. It's just a potential, just an idea. And if they tell me no, oh, no problem. I can back away from that, because I think that's part of the sharing the space that's really respectful. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right. So, Adam, maybe you do want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes. Hi, my name is Adam. I'm a therapist with the On Track program in New York. I work in an outpatient setting with first episode psychosis.
Oh, good.
And I'm fairly new to this work. But I really resonate a lot with how you really engage with the content of psychosis. I find that a lot of clinicians I work with resort immediately to sort of reality testing and CBT, that kind of thing. And there's sort of this delicacy, though, in the joining process with clients, that it takes time, that it can't be rushed. And I found in my own experience working with clients, I think one of the most challenging manifestations of psychosis is with paranoia. And that joining process has been so difficult for me. I mean, there can be like a concreteness around it. It can be hard not to get sort of pulled into the paranoia myself, or to become sort of a part of sort of the story that they tell. I'm wondering if you could speak sort of specifically on your experience working with clients who exhibit paranoia and how you sort of go about the joining process with them.
I think you're right. It's very challenging, and you can very quickly become part of their delusional system if you step on in the wrong place. So the way I handle it is I really I focus more here. I listen to the content, but I focus more on the emotion, right? What is the affect state? So my patient, who was quite paranoid, who I described, who wouldn't come into my office. He was so paranoid he wouldn't even come into the office. I addressed more the feeling, right? How it must feel, the danger, the lack of safety, right? The other thing that's important about paranoia that people don't emphasize, right, enough, is their need for contact. You have to imagine that one of the things about paranoia is that they're never alone. Paranoia means never having to be alone because people are always after them, watching them, following them. And so, embedded in this symptom is an object need, but that object need it goes against the need to be safe. So if you can present that dilemma, that conflict, that can resonate with someone who's paranoid, that they do want the contact, but they've created a world in which the contact comes from, a hostile source, right? So I go for affect, for the need for safety and the fear, and that can help to create an alliance. I see.
Good
Drew.
day, Dr. Knafo. My name is. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Dylan Lashley. I'm a doctoral student and therapist of mental health counseling. And I was just wondering how you would advise new therapists and doctoral students like myself in approaching the angry and aggressive drives of patients brought on by intrapsychic conflicts.
Angry. Okay, give me a little example.
Well, I noticed when I did my internship at Pilgrim State Hospital that a lot of my patients, a lot of the things that they brought up to me during therapy were based on their anger at the world, at family members. And I was just wondering how what you would say to clients, or what therapeutic techniques you would utilize in approaching these patients, and how you would advise new therapists in approaching these problems without offending patients or telling them they're deluded.
Yeah. Well, the other side of anger is fear. And if you can remember that, usually anger emboldens people. It makes them feel less vulnerable, right? And so it can be very, very strengthening for them. So you don't want, to just take that away. You want to, first of all, listen to their story. Why are they angry? Who did what to whom, right? How is there a basis for the anger? And what, little by little, you might be able to hear some fear right? Like the previous Adam's question about dealing with paranoia, because a lot of times the anger comes with paranoia. They're after me. They're doing this something to me. There's a victim. There's a doer and a done to. So you want to understand that dynamic and try to have some empathy for them and see where have they been wronged, right? Where have they been wronged, and are they generalizing that feeling to the world, to the outside world? So you want to connect with them in where they are and how difficult it is when people mistreat them or don't understand them, or but little by little you want to be able to see if they can show some vulnerability, some fear, because usually the other side of anger is fear. And that they're angry so that they don't have to feel that vulnerability. So if you're aware of that, I think it makes it easier to connect with somebody and explore with them.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a question: would you speak to the social status and power differences in the relationship? For example, Caucasian therapist and ethnic minority client, and how that relates to building a sense of safety.
Sure. Always. You always want to be aware of not just, intra-psychic, but what is in the room, how you might be perceived. And if it's something that's not mentioned, you can mention it. How do you feel working with, a white woman? Or how do you have any feelings about working with me? Do you feel I can understand you, right? Or is there something that you can tell me to help? If they keep saying you don't get me, you come from a different world, people will say that. And then you say, well, maybe I do come from a different world, but I want to understand you. Help me understand you. Tell me what you feel I don't understand, right? One of my patients who had a very extreme dissociative disorder, and some of the personalities there were psychotic. She told me one day, she said, how can you understand what I go through? And I told her, I said, well, I probably can understand exactly what you go through. I don't have 6 personalities. I said, but I didn't say that. I just said I probably can't exactly understand. I said, but I'm an immigrant, and I know different worlds and different languages and different, and I feel like I'm a different self in these different worlds. And I said, that's kind of like what you experience. And she loved that. So sometimes, even if you don't connect exactly on the same plane, you show a way that you might be similar, that you might have access to some of the dynamics that the person is struggling with. I see that Drew wants to ask a question.
Thank you. I know we're right up on our time limit, so I'll try to be brief. So I'm Drew. I'm a psychology postdoc at Cambridge Health Alliance. I also work in early interventions for psychosis and first episode psychosis. And something that I've struggled with a couple times, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is when there are moments when paranoia and aggression seem to be moving into action. And you're concerned for the safety of someone else and your patient's life. How do you work with that? I've tried saying things we can talk about all these feelings, all these thoughts, these fantasies. What's important is that we keep them here and that they don't move into action.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems kind of helpful, kind of not. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, look, you have to do an evaluation to see whether somebody really might be of danger to somebody else. So I'm very direct and very open. Let's talk openly about this. I see you feeling very angry. It's not just anger or expressing anger. It's possible harm, which could include to you. And I've had patients like that, where I sometimes was a little afraid. That you have to address it head on and don't keep it to yourself or try to be Mr. Nice Guy. You have to say, you know, I get the sense, yeah, I'm getting a little scared. You don't. Harold Searle said once, the therapist sits in the most comfortable chair. What does that mean? We have to feel comfortable when we're conducting treatment. So if you're uneasy between sessions and you're thinking, I'm going to, you know, reading the newspaper to see whether your patient killed somebody in between your sessions, that's not a good thing, right? So you have to take stronger, you know, even though I use medication as a last resort, somebody might need some medication, and you might talk to them about, you know, lessening some of that anger, because a lot of people who are that angry are also afraid of their anger. They're afraid of what their anger can do. Like my patient who was so afraid he wouldn't even come to see me in person. So in some ways, okay, let them, you know, create certain protective barriers.
All right. Well, I hear we have to wind up because somebody else is going to come right in here. So
Okay.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. We really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. You can contact me if you have more questions.
Great. Thank you.